Chapter 27 Lord Latimer's Ladies by Margaret Elin Schmidt and Dan McLaughlin. Read by Dan McLaughlin. Chapter 27 To the Castle at Once. Alice sat in the carriage, willing it to go faster. Although she knew intellectually she could not actually get out of the carriage and run faster than the horses, she wanted to try. Not that she was in anything like running shape. What she really wanted was a race car or a bullet train. While certainly carriage rides were rustic and could even be a trifle romantic, Alice had someplace she needed to be, and the romantic carriage was not getting her there fast enough. In fact, a glance out of the window confirmed that they were traveling at what could probably be called a decorous pace. She needed something better. Among the accoutrements she'd been handed as lady of the castle was a parasol. Not being a vampire, she hadn't needed to shield herself from the sun, but it did have a nice handle, suitable to wrap against the carriage ceiling. "What's the driver's name, Miss Pocket?" Alice asked. "Charles, my lady," supplied Miss Pocket, in her role as Siri of the 19th century. "Thank you," Alice said, and with the hard-handed parasol knocked the carriage ceiling sharply several times, then bellowed in a most unladylike way, "Charles! Yo, Charles!" The carriage slowed as the coachman reined the horses back. The rattle and rumble of their steady travel lost some of its volume, and now the driver could at least make an attempt to hear his mistress. "You called, my lady?" His tone was respectful and neutral. "Can this thing go any faster?" "Well," said Charles, "it can." Alice was glad she couldn't see the coachman's face, but she was perfectly able to imagine how incredulous he must look. "I must return to the castle as soon as possible," she said. Feeling that he might need some persuasion, she added, "Lord Latimer needs me." "Well, my lady, the road is not in the best of," Charles began, in the tone of someone who felt obligated to explain why sticking one's hand down a garbage disposal was not a very good idea, especially when someone else was fiddling with the fuse box. "Time is of the essence," interrupted Alice with what she hoped was bold resolution. "To the castle at once, and as fast as you can, Charles." Alice reflected for the moment that it was nice to be able to take charge of at least one thing in her chaotic life. "Very well, my lady," said Charles. His whip snapped and the carriage lurched forward. The difference was obvious at once. Now it was clear that the carriage was going as fast as it could without falling to pieces. Inside, Alice and Miss Pocket held on tightly to keep themselves from falling clear out of the windows as they were jostled about. Outside, the footman to the carriage hung on for dear life as it careened down the road. From the sound of it, they were loving the experience. The new Lord and Lady of Dartmoor were certainly making their lives far more interesting. Alice gathered from the sounds of whooping and shouting. Miss Pocket had gone pale, but as she sat on the other side of the carriage, she tried to keep her ladylike composure. She tightened her hand on a strap for balance. The newly purchased quill set was carefully clenched in her other hand, but as the carriage lurched around a sharp bend in the road, she must have decided it behooved her to make some attempt to distract her mistress. "It is a fine quill set, my lady," she offered, though she had to raise her voice considerably to be heard over the noise of the wheels on the road and the creaking of the rocking coach. It somewhat lessened the air of normalcy the maid was valiantly striving to maintain. "They say a fine quill can last for years, ever so much more than an inferior one." "I haven't got years, Miss Pocket," Alice shouted back. She was taking an almost savage joy in the feeling that something was finally going the way she wanted it to go. "I haven't got hours, and I very much hope I won't even have a minute to sit down and try out any of those fine quills. I haven't got time to write or anyone to write to. God!" Alice's next words were lost as the carriage hit a rather large pothole and she was nearly thrown out of her seat. "All to..." Again, her words ebbed as they bounced through another pothole. "Stupid ways to travel, this has to be," said Alice, then gasped as the carriage rounded a hairpin turn, where at least two of its wheels left the ground. "What the..." Her voice was drowned out by the exhilarated shouts from the footmen who, it would seem, considered themselves lucky not to have been killed just then. "Who designed this?" Alice was being flung from side to side at a rapid pace and consequently was losing her grip on her 1810s vocabulary. She was also seriously wishing someone had invented seat belts already. If Miss Pocket, among her many other talents, had been adept at reading lips, she must have been impressed by the strength of Alice's language, if not its suitability for genteel society. "Brian and his" was the next audible expression of irritation from Alice. Just before the carriage hit a rock or a log, or possibly a trampoline, and the ladies in the coach were hurled upwards, the grooms hollered with joy. "Diabetes? This is not my—" Alice had come to use the carriage ride at this point as some sort of catharsis. "Fault!" she shouted as they rolled into the castle's scenic drive and began to slow down. Alice drew a deep breath and refrained from uttering any more profanities as the carriage came to a halt. Outside, the grooms were congratulating themselves on having survived the wildest carriage ride ever, and the horses were stamping and breathing heavily, evidently feeling as if they had also quite enjoyed the run. "The castle, my lady," said Charles, "as quick as possible, as you asked." One of the grooms, grinning madly and considerably more windblown when he had been when they had departed from the village, opened the door while the other provided the step for the ladies to dismount. Alice was more than a little amazed that the step had somehow managed to stay attached to the carriage, but aside from Miss Pocket, the rest of the servants on the carriage were clearly delighted by the orders of the lady of the castle had delivered. Alice drew another deep breath and in a hurried whisper hissed, "Give me the purse, please." Miss Pocket fumbled for it, and Alice took it, but that was all the time she gave herself before stepping out into the fresh air. She did take a moment on the step stool, serenely composed, at least on the surface. Alice could tell the combination of her headlong arrival and her calm exterior had gone a long way towards enhancing her reputation among the servants. This pause allowed Miss Pocket, who had not been asked to be tumbled around in the carriage, a chance to smooth her appearance, but it was also an opportunity for as many servants as were going to assemble to gather before her. She could already see the way the outdoor servants were whispering to the indoor ones, and she knew the story of the wild ride was being passed along. Her earlier confrontation with Mrs. Downs had made Alice appreciate the theatrical element inherent in her role as lady of the manor. She was a rock star back home, or at least in a band. She wasn't going to be upstaged again, even by a pair of sweaty horses. When it seemed to her that the time was right, she began her descent, allowing the footman to give her his hand for support, though she tried not to look like she needed it. She carefully reached into the purse for a handful of coins and gave one to each footman and groom, saving the largest for the coachman himself. Charles had swung down from the carriage and gone straight to check on the horses. Now he was awaiting her and stepped forward as soon as Alice had finished distributing money among the lesser servants. She gave him a smile and pressed the largest coin into his hand. "Thank you, Charles. That was exceedingly well done." "Thank thee, my lady," he said as he tugged his forelock. It was another of those gestures Alice had read about, but assumed were pure nonsense. But as Charles had lost his hat somewhere along the road, it seemed perfectly natural in context. "Will someone please take a message to my brother?" Alice turned and asked politely of the gathered throng. "Tell Lord Latimer that I have news of the utmost importance from the village. I will be waiting for him and for our guest to join me in the music room. Ah," she added almost casually, "and if one of you will ask Mrs. Downs to bring a small luncheon and a tray of drinks for us there, too, I would be very grateful." Alice sailed from the carriageway, up the stairs, and into the house, feeling like a swan, elegant on the surface and paddling madly underneath. She only wished that she could have figured out the best 19th century way to ask that lunch should include a pitcher of margaritas. If the horribly bumpy ride wasn't enough of a reason to take up day drinking, well, the confrontation she meant to have in just a few minutes would be. End of chapter 27 of Lord Latimer's Ladies, written by Margaret Elin Schmidt and Dan McLaughlin, Read by Dan McLaughlin.